All right, so once you've incorporated your keyways on the back of the models, okay, sometimes you might have a little flash around the model. You might want to go back and just gently trim it off, if you do, from the models you were provided. Make sure that we have a nice clean surface all around. You want to make sure that obviously when you were trimming the models, this is a very flat surface. And when putting the models together, just tentatively holding them together, the base of the models appear to be parallel to each other. Okay? Okay, so once again, we are going to place these models together in centric occlusion. Okay? I tend to hold the lower cast in my right hand because I'm right-handed, and the upper cast in my left hand, so I have a better idea how this fits up against that. So I try to get a sense of a nice tight centric occlusion, maximum intercuspation in centric occlusion. So when I jiggle the models together, they feel like they're locking with each other. So that feels pretty good. Okay? Obviously, the more teeth you have, the more noticeable this becomes. The less teeth, you might run into problems where you might even require a bite block to get the right centric occlusion. But in this particular case, everything feels pretty tight in centric. So once I have a very tight feel, I'm going to hold the models together. I haven't separated the models. I'm going to hold the models together with my left hand. Then I'm going to take a number 7 spatula and apply some wax as much as I can. Nice hot wax. In between the casts. Okay. So once again, the models, they look like they're parallel with each other, if they're trimmed properly, obviously. And everything is in a nice, tight, centric bite. So they're held together by the wax now. It makes it a lot easier if the models are dry when you're applying the wax, because if you're working with wet casts, then the wax might separate. It might not adhere to the cast as well as it does when they're dry. Okay, the next step, I'm going to take a little bit of separator and I'm going to apply a little bit of separator on the back of the casts before mounting them. If you have excess separator on the back of the casts, it's important that you blow off the excess separator with your air nozzle, so you only have a very fine film of separator. In fact, I even get into the habit of just kind of smearing it around with my finger to make sure it's a very thin layer of separator. And I'll do the same thing on the opposing as well. Blow off the excess. And I'll wipe off if there's any extra residue with my finger. I'm going to let those models sit there, just wipe my hands. Now the next little bit, we have to mount these models on an articulator. For this particular case, we're going to use a simple hinge articulator, which is this device that you see here, and it comes in 2 pieces with a lower and upper member. They tend to go together by just interlocking one side, squeezing the pin back, and allowing the other one to fit in there as well. It's got an adjustable pin, although it doesn't really work great for edentulous cases, but it's pretty useful for when you have tooth-to-tooth contact as we do here. So for now, before we articulate, I want you to open the little washer in the back and unwind the pin all the way open. So the pin is not being used at all. I want complete hinging of this articulator. Now this is a very simple articulator, but you can see here a little bit on the side, it's got a bit of an incline. It's about a 20-degree incline, 15 to 20-degree incline that somewhat simulates a lateral excursion. So for basic partial cases, acrylic partial cases, it's a pretty useful tool, but if you get anything extensive, you might want to be using a semi-adjustable or a fully adjustable articulator. Even with an average mounting, it's still a lot better than this. Okay? So what we need to keep in mind is that we need to have these models between the upper and lower member of the articulator while the plane of occlusion is parallel to the table. Regardless of how you've trimmed the models, the plane of occlusion needs to be parallel to the hinge axis of the articulator, this here, and it also needs to be parallel to the tabletop when you're mounting it. So when you mount, you have to get down to the tabletop level and visually assess that you're parallel to the table left and right and front and back. Okay? And also provide adequate plaster support with the articulator on each side. So the underside of the lower cast and the side of the upper cast, you want at least about 15 to 20 millimeters of plaster support on either side. And we're going to do this all at the same time. It's a one-time deal. So once you start mixing, you have to have everything prepared. Make sure that you have your bowl, your spatula, your water, everything is separated, your articulator is cleaned off. I like to use a piece of paper towel on the bench when I apply my plaster, so that way I can rotate the case so I can clean off the excess plaster. Okay? All right. Going, get a bowl with some plaster in it, about 1.5 cups or 2 cups worth of plaster, and introduce some water to get a relatively thick consistency. You don't want a very runny consistency now. You want a relatively thick mix because the density of the plaster needs to support the weight of the models, as you'll see when I'm start mounting. So you can't have your plaster very, very, very thin. Okay? So, of course, you will need to vibrate or spatulate over the vibrator to get a nice mix. So I got my case, I got my articulator, I got the paper towel. I'm going to introduce some water. To my plaster. A little more. And having a relatively thick mix. Obviously, for the demo purposes, I'm using just another bowl for the water, but of course you'll be doing this in a processing room that you have access to a sink, and you would use the sink as your water source. So once I have a good mix, I'm going to vibrate it. For a good 20-30 seconds. Set that aside. Paper towel. And I'm going to introduce just a little bit of plaster on the paper towel itself. About 6-7 millimeters in thickness. Bring my articulator over. Don't press it all the way down. Leave some thickness of plaster under the articulator. Introduce another 15 to 20 millimeters of plaster on top of that, covering the whole underside of the articulator. Bring your lower model over with a little bit of plaster, smear inside the keyways. Now going over to the top, a little bit of plaster. I'm going to smear some plaster firmly inside the keyways, and then get some more right on top of it. And now I'm going to come down here and make sure that I'm centered over the articulator and I'm parallel interiorly, posteriorly, as well as left and right. Now this happens very quickly, and it all depends on how you store your plaster and how much moisture the plaster has in it already. And in this particular case, it looks like there's excess moisture inside the plaster as it was stored. So it's starting to set a little quicker on me than I would like. I'm going to wet my spatula, and while this is setting, I'm going to flatten the top. And with the edge of my spatula, I'm going to cut off the excess plaster from the sides of the cast. I tend to leave the plaster back here alone. If I have any voids in my mounting, I'm going to take a little bit of plaster that I have, make sure that I fill it all the way. And you can see that the thickness of the plaster support is about good 15-20 millimeters in thickness all the way around. The lower one is a little bit challenging, but you can take your plaster knife and carve away the excess like that. And I'll just usually wipe it up against my hand. If you want to buy a little more working time, you can certainly introduce some more water into your mix. But keep in mind, keeping it too thin will not be able to support the weight of the models. So you have to make that call. The best thing to do is to store your plaster properly so you don't have excess moisture incorporated into your plaster as it's stored, because that will reduce the working time. So a good idea is to store your plaster in a plastic bin with a cover at least. So I'm going to let that set completely. And with a nice sharp instrument, either a plaster knife or a 7R, you can carve away the excess. In fact, I'm going to do it now very gently. So I don't have a lot of trimming to do. There's hardly anything. I'm going to trim off the excess, and all I got to do is get some sandpaper and smooth out the sides. Like I said earlier, I tend to leave the plaster in the back here of the articulator. It actually provides a little more support, so it's actually to my advantage. And besides, it's very difficult to get back there and clean it, so I tend to leave it. I got a bit of a void right here. So before the plaster sets thoroughly, I can mix a little more plaster and incorporate it in there, just to clean up that little pocket. So I'm going to clean off the sides here. I can feel the plaster setting some more. It's getting harder to trim, but it's still relatively soft enough to go through it with a nice sharp instrument. Notice that the top of the plaster mounting is parallel to the base of the cast. If it's not, take some time to carve it back. But it looks pretty good. And once this plaster sets for at least half an hour, only then I'm going to use some clean water to boil off this wax so I can open the articulator so we can move on to the next step.